Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody that's joining us for today's advisor webinar. I think we have a couple more folks that are going to be hopping on, so we'll give them a couple of seconds, but thank you to everyone that is on the call already. So today's webinar is titled Move Over Millennials. It's time for Generation Z. I'm excited to be joining all of you today to do this advisor webinar. My name is Michelle Marchand, and I serve Delta Upsilon as the Senior Director of Chapter Development. I've been on Delta Upsilon staff since 2011 in a couple of different roles, but most recently in this role for a little over a year and a half. And one of my great benefits of this role is getting to work with our advisors. And I know I send all of you plenty of emails telling you about these webinars and advisors academies, but it's always nice when I get to actually do one of the webinars and talk with all of you. So thank you for having me, and thank you for those of you who suggested this topic for one of our advisor webinars. All right, so a couple of prefaces to put out there before we dig into this. I do not claim to be an expert at Generation Z or any generations. It's something that is an interest area of mine, and I did some reading this summer in preparation for another presentation that I did to another group on Generation Z. A lot of the content from this presentation came from a book called Generation Z Goes to College by Corey C. Miller and Megan Grace. And Corey and Megan were really one of the first researchers to do a significant look into this generation, particularly as this generation comes into college. I promise I'm not being paid to endorse the book in any way, but I do recommend it if you're looking to learn more about the generation. It's an easy read, it's a quick read, and it has a lot of good information well beyond what we have time to get into today. In addition to this, if you do a simple Google search of Generation Z, every day it seems like there is another article, another news story that comes out. We have been so obsessed with the millennial generation over the last couple of decades that really that shift is now starting to focus on Generation Z as we see them reaching their early 20s and starting in college, but also starting to enter the workforce. So lots of information coming out about Generation Z, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve as they get older as well. So I think it's important whenever we're talking about generations to do a little generation refresh. And part of that is to look at who are the generations that are alive today. And there's really 6 of those generations that are still out there, still involved in some capacity. And so I'm going to take a couple of minutes to go through a quick general overview of each of these generations. There are a lot of commonalities from one to the other, or you see how the way one generation acted impacts the next one, sometimes changing their perception of the world. So let's run through those real fast before we dig into some of the more specifics about Generation Z. So the first generation that's still out there is our GI generation, or the greatest generation, that Tom Brokaw wrote his well-known book about. Born 1901 to 1926, these were children of the World War I generation, and they fought in World War II. Their depression was the Great Depression, their war was the Big War, and their prosperity was the legendary Happy Days. They're assertive and energetic doers, excellent team players, community-minded, strongly interested in personal morality, and near absolute standards of right and wrong. This is the generation that spawned labor unions. They're strongly loyal to jobs, to groups, to schools. One of their mantras is use it up, fix it up, make it do, or do without. And they're really the last generation that remembers a life without airplanes, radio, and TV, as those came alive during their formative years. The next generation we'll talk about is the silent generation, born 1927 to 1945. They went through their formative years during an era of really suffocating conformity and post-war happiness. They are the generation of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. A lot of the men of this generation pledged loyalty to a corporation, essentially that idea that once you get a job, you basically keep that job for life. They have a strong sense of transgenerational common values and near absolute truths when it comes to morality. They're also the generation of big band and swing music, and they can be described as disciplined, self-sacrificing, and cautious. Next up, a group that is probably familiar to many of you are baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964. So the baby boomers were part of the post-war America that ushered in a healthy economy, consumerism, really the cure of the depression and the post-war blues. To them, hard work was the path to success. And their goal was really to achieve the American dream of having their own houses, cars, material possessions. They're the rock and roll music generation and the first true TV generation. They ushered in free love, societal nonviolent protest, the civil rights movement, and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. The women of this generation really began working outside the home in record numbers. They can be described as optimistic, driven, and team-oriented, and they tend to be more positive about authority, hierarchical structure, and tradition. Next up is Gen X. Gen X, born 1965 to 1980. Gen Xers are our latchkey kids. They're the ones that grew up street smart, but sometimes isolated. Sometimes they're coming from families that have more divorce and more career-driven parents than in previous generations. They grew up during the height of cable television, of MTV, and of Michael Jackson. They're entrepreneurial, very individualistic. They tend to commit to self rather than to an organization or a specific career. Government and big business mean little to them. They want to save their neighborhood, but not necessarily the world. They're cautious, skeptical, unimpressed with authority, self-reliant, and pragmatic. They're often regarded as the middle child between two very large generations that have received a great deal of attention. Next up are the Millennials. There we go. Millennials, generally born between 1981 and 1994. This is the generation of 9/11 and of school shootings. They've been nurtured by ever-present parents. They're optimistic and focused, and they have strong support systems. They've been criticized for being entitled and expecting things to be handed to them, leading to the perception of them as self-interested and overconfident. They've used their 20s as a time to further their education, launch their careers, and practice introspection to determine what they want in life versus getting married and starting a family like previous generations. They largely grew up in a digital environment with unlimited access to information. They envision the world as a 24/7 place where they're always connected, and they do not work to live. They prefer a more relaxed work environment with hand-holding and accolades. And then finally, the group that we will spend the most time talking about today is Generation Z, generally born between about 1996 and 2010. This is our first true digital native generation, meaning they have never known a world without computers, cell phones, and social media. They're our most racially diverse generation to date. They've lived in a world at war for the majority of their lives. They're savvy consumers. They know what they want and how to get it. And they're often oversaturated with brands and messaging. They're smart, they're efficient, and they're in tune with the world, both online and offline. They see problems, but they want to find solutions, and they know how to wield their tools and their knowledge to do so. What I have next is a lovely Venn diagram here. I did not create this, I found it, but I think it's a great image to show some of the similarities and differences between the millennials and Generation Z. There are a lot of similarities when it comes to the tech side of things. The way they have a skeptic outlook in terms of their view of corporations. They think very entrepreneurial, both of them. They both want to make a difference. But then you start to get into some of the differences between the two, and you start to see where Gen Z really separates itself from the millennials. The fact that they are the first true digital native generation really makes a difference to their view of the world and the way they interact with people. While our millennials have grown up with technology and adapted to it and adopted to it over the years, the millennials, especially the older millennials, can recall a time without the internet, or when they first started using internet and it was dial-up and it took forever to get on. Whereas Gen Z, they've really had, phones and iPads and computers in their hands from a very young age. One of the other differences when you compare the two is that Gen Z, despite their focus on technology, they still have, or they've developed a desire for that personal connection and face-to-face communication that's different than what we've seen from the millennials. So let's get into some more details about Gen Z. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. Okay, so as when I was talking about the book earlier from C. Miller and Grace, one of the things that they did in their research is look at the way that Generation Z's perspectives have been shaped. And through their research, they came up with basically these 6 general areas that have shaped the way Generation Z looks at the world and interacts with the world. So the first one is information at their fingertips. Like we said before, this generation has always had access to information 24/7. However, just because that information is available doesn't mean it's all true. And so they've had to struggle in evaluating the reliability and the quality of the information that they're receiving. Also, when you think about information being at their fingertips, in nearly every aspect of their lives, they can basically get something when they want it. So you look at things like Netflix and Hulu, Amazon, those are providing instant gratification in a way that wasn't available to previous generations. The second thing that has really shaped their perspective is that constant connection piece. So over 80% of Gen Zs already had a cell phone well before arriving at college. And that number is likely to grow as the age at which a child receives their first phone continues to decrease. But because of that, this generation really suffers from what they call FOMO, F-O-M-O, which means fear of missing out. They want to be in the know, they want to be connected, and they are connected at nearly all hours of the day. So because of this, time and space are really more fluid for Generation Z. The third thing that has shaped their perspective is creative entrepreneurship. I can't say that word well. Generation Z has witnessed many startups that are meeting needs that maybe we didn't even know were actually needs. So when you think about things like Uber or Airbnb or TaskRabbit, we were probably pretty cool with taxis and cabs until Uber came along and Lyft came along, and we realized, oh wow, this is actually much better. Why didn't we think about this beforehand? Or Airbnb. We don't always have to stay in hotels. Now we have this option to stay in someone's home or apartment. And it's shaped the way they look at new opportunities. They really see this as a sharing economy. So thinking like, why not rent my textbooks instead of buy them, borrow them, rent them, share them? They're identifying new ways to be their own boss. The fourth thing that has shaped their perspectives are disasters and tragedies. So while this generation was really too young to witness or to truly understand September 11th, they have witnessed the aftermath by watching our involvement in ongoing wars and conflicts that appear to have no real end in sight. So they were really just reaching adolescence when the Great Recession hit. And many of their families were affected by lost jobs or lost homes. They've been warned that danger could lurk around any corner. And because of that, they're not the same risk takers as compared to previous generations. They will still take risk, but they're much more calculated than we've seen before. The fifth one, we have one more after that, is diversity and social justice. So their beliefs about diversity and social justice are most certainly influenced by their exposure to a wider range of people different from them. They have, again, going back to that information at their fingertips, that constant connection, they have access and connection to a wider range of people than ever before. However, this is interesting, especially for any Gen Xers that are listening right now. Gen Z is the least likely of the four most recent generations to believe in the concept of the American dream, that idea that initiative and hard work offers an equal opportunity for people to prosper. This isn't really a surprise when you consider that Gen Z's parents, who are mostly Gen Xers, are the second least likely to believe in that American dream idea. Gen Z understands that they understand the role that access, equity, and equality can play in achieving a person's dream. And then finally, the sixth perspective that has really shaped them is related to budget cuts. And they've really witnessed cutbacks nearly their whole lives, from things as big as the Great Recession's job losses to funding cuts for education and sports. They're more financially conservative than we have seen with the millennial generation. So let's talk a little bit more about the characteristics of Gen Z. So when C. Miller and Grace were doing their research, one of the questions that they actually asked Generation Z was, how would you describe yourself? And through that question and that research, they came down to these 6 common characteristics that Gen Z believes they exhibit. And I think that's an important part to point out here is this right here, this list of characteristics is coming from Gen Z themselves, as opposed to some of these other pieces that are based upon research, what the researchers have seen, have witnessed. This list is straight from them, straight from their mouths. So these 6 characteristics are how Gen Z sees themselves and the way they interact with the world. So the first one being loyal. Gen Z says that they exhibit strong feelings and strong concern for those around them. They align their own support, with issues that affect everyone, not just themselves. And so that really strikes a contrast to what we saw with a lot of the millennials who were very focused on me, as opposed to Gen Z looking out and trying to be supportive and caring for others and issues that affect other people and being loyal in that regard. The second characteristic that they described themselves was thoughtful. And this is kind of connected to that loyalty piece where they appear genuinely concerned about issues facing other people and they care for them. Their relationships, their connections are at a different level than the previous generation. The third word they used to describe themselves was compassionate. And when you think about how this generation has had access to unlimited information, that's given them the ability to learn about various topics and current issues in real time. So because of that, they've been able to see the effect of events and experiences on real people. Not just news reporting live, but the ability to see when something happens, it's on social media immediately. And so this generation is able to connect with those incidents, with those people in a quicker and different way than previous generations have. And so that's really spurred them to be more compassionate, to want to do more to help others. The fourth characteristic that they use to describe themselves is open-minded. And this is basically their ability to consider new perspectives, ideas, and ways of believing. They think that diversity is a good thing. And part of that, again, coming from the fact that this is the most diverse generation to date, and their ability to connect with people, not just in their town or in their county or in their city where they grew up, but literally across the world through the use of technology. The fifth thing that they use to describe themselves is responsible. So part of the financial and political instability of the post 9/11 world created a situation in which Gen Z students crave predictability and order. They've taken this approach of, if not you, then who, when it comes to life and their responsibilities and their choices. And so they're willing to take that on in a way that we didn't see with the millennials, where maybe the millennials were wanting more help, more hand-holding. Gen Z is really starting to take more responsibility in that, really as a result of that instability over the last decade or so in our world and economy. And then finally, the sixth word that they used to describe themselves was determined. So you talk about kind of the pendulum swinging here. Back in the millennial time, that was when we were seeing the notion of everybody gets a trophy. Well, that has started to swing back. And so Gen Z is learning that not everybody gets a trophy, or not everybody deserves a trophy. They see that hard work is a part of life, and you've got to put in that hard work. You have to stay focused and not give up in order to be recognized and to make a difference. So one of the other parts of the research, and I thought this was particularly important for our advisors, is to understand how Gen Z views leadership, how they look at leaders, what they expect of leaders, what they expect of themselves as leaders. And so just wanted to quickly hit on a couple of these pieces that came up from that research. When they look at leadership, one of the things that comes up is this idea of leveraging the capacities of others. And for those of you who are familiar with Strengths Quest and Strengths Finder, that's a great example of something that our students have been exposed to in a different way than previous generations. So this idea of, here's my strengths, here's your strengths, instead of focusing on our weaknesses, if I use my strengths and you use your strengths, we're going to create, a better outcome as a result of that. So again, that idea of leveraging the capacities, the strengths of other people. One of the other parts of the way they view leadership is this idea of engaging in complex thinking and innovative problem solving. And part of that can go back to how they've grown up as digital natives in this digital world, and really the ability for them to think outside the box, where we may have been in a uh, I think the millennial generation has certainly learned to think outside of the box as well. For Gen Z, it has always been like that. The idea of creating, of new technology, what are the things that we don't realize we need, but we actually need? So thinking on a more complex level there. Also, this idea of utilizing a collaborative and interdependent approach. That goes back part of it to leveraging the strengths of other people. How can they work together to achieve goals? How can they work together to achieve things that maybe each person or each group wants, that have some connections, that maybe have some interdependent pieces to it, but also are separate? How can we collaborate to find the end result that both people or both groups want through their similarities and through their differences? This shouldn't come as a surprise, but Generation Z wants their leaders to be able to communicate effectively. And part of that comes from the reliance on social media, shifting back to actually being able to communicate in person too. It's one thing to be able to put something out there into the internet world, but how do you have to actually be able to communicate in person, face to face as well, in order to be seen as a credible leader. And then being adaptable, knowing that kind of turning into where this generation, how they've grown up, the world in which they've grown up, that idea of being able to adapt to changing situations is very important to them as leaders and as those they look up to as leaders. And then a couple other pieces in terms of leadership. Guiding others to greatness. They want leaders who help others, whether it's through mentoring or sponsoring others, but they also want to do that for other people. So unlike that millennial generation that we always heard was so me, 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 Gen Z wants to help others along the way as well. They want optimistic leaders. They want people who look at the challenges of the world, but are able to focus on how those can be overcome. That ties directly into the next one on persevering through adversity. We know that there's challenges. We know they've grown up in a difficult economy and recession. They've seen people overcome that or push through that. And so they want leaders that are able to recognize challenges, but also keep leading through that. And then finally, this idea of employing honesty and altruism. They really want to do good for the world, and they want to be honest about that. So one of the other pieces that I thought was interesting was about role models, who Gen Z views as role models. And some of these people, I think you would expect, they look up to parents, they look up to teachers, they look up to coaches. But this generation also looks to their peers as role models as well, in maybe a different way that we didn't see before. And part of that coming from the entrepreneurial nature of their peers. They see so many of their friends and classmates who have these great ideas and are starting companies and starting new organizations on campus, and they really look at and admire them as examples of, well, if they can do it, I can do it too. I need to, push forward with my goals and dreams. The other thing I thought was interesting in the research is this group really looks up to fictional characters in a way that the previous generation didn't. So thinking about Harry Potter or Katniss Everdeen, they grew up reading the Harry Potter books. And while they may be fictional characters, they see themselves in these fictional characters and they connect with them in a different way. And I thought that was a really interesting part in this research. On the flip side, who they don't consider to be role models has changed from previous generations. So they don't consider bosses, sorry, Michael Scott, they don't consider bosses to be role models like previous generations have. They don't really look up to religious figures. And part of that is connected to the changing landscape of how they view religion in general, and this being a less religious and more spiritual generation. They also don't look up to celebrities or professional athletes or even political figures in a way that previous generations have. And part of that is due to a distrust of those public figures because of scandals and issues, and maybe not the clean cut or wholesome image that previous generations looked up to when it came to their professional athletes or celebrities. So one of the big parts that you all are probably wondering is, okay, great, we learned all this information about Generation Z. How do I communicate with them? Because I thought I had finally figured out how to communicate with the millennials, and now they're leaving. So a couple quick pieces to know about the communication side. So for them, texting, messaging, Facebook Messenger, those kind of things, those are quick and easy. They love the ability to send and receive messages frequently and from basically anywhere. When you consider most of Generation Z, they're sending over 100 plus texts a day. And to them, it's not an impersonal way of communicating. It's simply an easier way of communicating. So in just a few seconds, they can send a message to a classmate about a homework assignment. They can let their mom know that they're coming home this weekend. To them, it's just much quicker than writing an email or making a phone call. The flip side of that, though, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, is that they actually do prefer the face-to-face over Facebook. So yes, they still use social media. That's not going away. But they do find that face-to-face, in-person communication to be valuable. They like meeting up with their friends. They like doing things in person, but they'll just be Snapchatting and Instagramming while they're together, documenting their time together on social media. But it's important for them to have that in-person time together. Another thing to think about when communicating with them is the use of images. And I laughed when I read this, but I think it's really true that they like to use images in their messaging. So when you think of emojis and stickers and icons and filters and all the different things that are available in the social media world right now, for them, that helps to get their communication across in that quick and easy text format, but through the use of images. And so when you think about that, when you communicate with them, maybe it might seem silly, but that's been part of their digital native growth, is this use of images in a different way than we've seen images in the past. And then finally, email. So this is not going to come as a surprise, I think, to anybody. But Generation Z really associates emails with adults, and they think that email simply takes too much time between responses. So email to Generation Z is what typed memos or snail mail were to previous generations. It's not that they don't like email or want to use it. They just think it takes too long. Why send an email and wait 20 minutes or an hour for a response when I can text a question and get it answered within minutes or seconds? So I think for advisors in particular, when we struggle with being in contact with our chapter officers, thinking about, can we conform to their need of that text communication versus sending a big long email and waiting for a response? What's the more important part there? Is it getting all the information across, or is it getting that quick, easy answer in text and then following up with a face-to-face conversation later that week at the chapter colony meeting? A couple other things to think about as we wrap up our call today on working with Generation Z. So as we've talked about, clearly this generation has a level of technological sophistication that we've not seen previously. And that can definitely be a hurdle for advisors, alumni, friends that are working with this generation, that for many of us, we're just not as technologically savvy as this generation is. We haven't grown up automatically knowing how to operate an iPhone like so many students in this generation have. And so how can we rely on them and sort of balance that in order to be successful? I think part of it is us knowing that that's simply not our strength in the same way that it is theirs. So how can we work with them to find that sort of common ground when it comes to using technology? And what can they teach us that might help us as advisors, as staff members, as alumni, to do our role even better as well? Another thing to think about when working with them is this DIY attitude about skills. And this generation, if they need to learn how to do something, in so many cases, it's as easy as going to YouTube and typing in, "How do I?" and they will find a video for whatever it is that they're trying to figure out. I remember I was trying to learn how to do something in Excel, and I understand the basics of Excel. I've been using it for many years, but there's a lot of things that Excel does that I don't know about. And so asking some of our younger staff members about it, and they said, "Well, I don't know, but let me look it up." And within seconds, they found a great video that was able to teach me exactly what I needed to do in Excel. And that's what this generation, that's the attitude they take when it comes to figuring things out. If I don't know it, I'm going to find out a way to do it because all this information is out there and I'm able to access it in an instant. Another thing when working with them is understanding that they are actually the true multitaskers. So we all think that we know how to multitask, but this generation has grown up with that in a very different way than previously. Most people can't actually multitask and be successful with all of the things we say we're working on. But this generation can. And part of that is because of that native digital connection. They can be connected, they can be sending messages, they can be looking up things and working on several different projects at the same time, because for them, there are layers there that run into each other, that connect. And so they might be multitasking on different tasks, but there are similarities that are connecting those. And so they're able to be more successful with that than previous generations. Also important to remember, and we've mentioned this a couple times, is this idea of realistic versus optimistic. This generation is realistic in terms of the challenges that they've faced, but that's not holding them back. They're still optimistic about the future. So when you're working with Generation Z, how can you be realistic about situations, give them the truth, give them the hard facts, but then also start to think about, where do we go from here? It's not all doom and gloom. Maybe our chapter has struggled in these 3 or 4 or 5 different areas in the past. We have to know them. We have to admit to them. But these students have that capacity to want to look forward. So how can we use that optimistic nature to help move that group along their journey? And then finally, honesty. Unlike the millennials that got a lot of flack for only wanting to hear the good things and not wanting to take feedback or not taking feedback well, this generation wants that honesty. It's never going to be easy for anybody to take feedback. Most people, don't like that. But when you compare Gen Z with the millennials, Gen Z wants that honesty. They want to know what's not working, what's not going to go the right way, so that they can make those changes and see a successful outcome. So that honesty aspect, whether it be from advisors, whether it be from alumni, that's really important to them when they're looking at moving forward. So, as I said at the beginning, not an expert on Generation Z, but it's definitely an area that I think is really interesting. There's so much research coming out. We really only have the first year or two or three of Generation Z in college right now. And so we're going to continue to learn more about them as they wrap up their time in college and enter the workforce. And we'll start to see some shifts too, just like we see with the millennials. You know, the older millennials are different in many ways than the younger millennials, but they still share a lot of common characteristics. And we can anticipate that with Generation Z as well. There's a level of consistency that will be there when we talk about their characteristics and their beliefs and values. But we also know that things will start to shift as more of the generation comes to college and more of the generation moves on, enters the workforce, and then eventually wants to start giving back and helping the fraternity as well. So if anybody has any questions, I know there's a question box that you are, we have a couple questions that have come in, and I will try to answer a couple of these. One was talk about group text. Do you recommend that we do this with the entire chapter? That's a great question, Jamie. So for those of you that are familiar with GroupMe, that app has become so popular with chapters where they have a GroupMe for the entire chapter, for the exec board, with certain advisors, whatever it might be. And that's really shown a lot of that's shown to be successful in many aspects. I think part of what comes along with using those group messaging tools like that is being able to address, especially as an advisor, what they're putting in there. And is it solely focused on chapter versus other issues that might be arising or other conversations? An easy Google search will bring up examples of fraternities that have been closed or gotten into significant trouble for putting highly inappropriate things in those group chats and those getting out. And so I think that's a great opportunity for advisors to come in and provide some mentoring to the group of what we think might be private is never truly private when we're talking about the technology world. And I think as we have, you look at the research, as this generation moves more forward into college, I think you'll probably see them having a better grasp of that compared to those who are there right now, where some of these things are still new, if that makes sense. Another question we had was, does this generation worry about money, student loans? Absolutely, Rich. Great question. Part of the concern with the economy and the recession has led more students of this generation to look towards other educational opportunities beyond your typical four-year college. We're seeing more students who are choosing to go to community college for a year or two to save money before transferring to your typical four-year flagship state university. You're also seeing more students take responsibility for paying for their fraternity dues in a way that we didn't see as much with the millennials. When you look at the millennials and the millennials' parents being baby boomers for the most part, they were very supportive of their children's involvement, not just in college, but growing up. You know, these are the kids who are playing like 3, 4 sports a year. They were super involved. Their parents wanted that of them. And so when they got to college, the students wanted to continue to be involved, and the parents continue to want to support them in many ways. And so part of that was millennials, joining fraternities at highest rates in years. And on the flip side, now that we have this generation coming to college, one, it's going to be a smaller generation than the millennials, and their likelihood of joining fraternities and sororities is less than the millennials, again, tied to some of those financial pieces, some of the pieces of wanting to be responsible, look at the world in a different way. And that's not to say that fraternities can't support all of those pieces. They absolutely can, but our messaging around some of those opportunities around recruitment, it's going to have to change. We're going to have to start to appeal to the entrepreneurial nature of today's students. We're going to have to appeal to that diversity and social justice side of the students. And that's really going to require some of our groups to change in a way that they haven't before. Let's see here. We got another question. Lots of great questions. Thank you, everybody that's sharing these. We've got one here about the gaming generation. And so that, it seems more difficult to pull many individuals away from video games and technology out of the dorms doing things together, and how that relates to Generation Z. And I think that's a great question. I believe, and I'm not entirely sure on this, but I believe the idea of the gaming generation is a subset of the tail end of the millennials into some of the early parts of the Generation Z. And so from a couple of things I've read, one of the benefits or one of the things that we might be able to pull from this idea of the gaming generation is, how do we make some of the things we do with our chapters games, and that gamification strategy? Are there ways that we can award certain behaviors or levels or points or badges or whatever it might be, to get them to see some of those opportunities, and from that sort of game mentality that they've been so used to? I will be honest though, Adam, I think that's a great question that I am not entirely equipped to answer, but it's certainly something I'd like to look more into. And that's a great thing that you pointed it out. Question about who conducted the survey. Was it Generation X? So the book was written by somebody who is the two people, one is a Gen Xer and one is a millennial. And so they did the research over the past, I think it was 4 or 5 years, largely when Generation Z was, the front part of Generation Z was in high school and starting to get to college. So when we're talking about Generation Z in the context of Delta Upsilon and of the fraternity, we're really looking at our freshmen, our sophomores, maybe some of our juniors. That's really the beginning of Gen Z. We're graduating the last of the millennials right now. And one of the things that's interesting, if you look at any generational issues, is there's always a cusp. There's always a cusp between generations. So if you go back to Gen X and millennials, there's a 3, 4, 5 year cusp where people born from 1978 to 1983 or so, they exhibit qualities of both Gen X and the millennials. Personally, love talking about it because I fall into that zone. And we're going to see that in the same way right now with the millennials and Gen Z, where we really have these cuspers, and they still exhibit some of those millennial qualities. And that's why when you're probably going through some of the stuff today, you may not see as much of this going on with the students you have right now, but you will continue to see it come out even more as this generation comes further into college, if that makes sense. But really this group is because they're on that cusp, we're going to see some overlap there between the two generations and the characteristics of the two generations as well. And then we've got a question, does this mean they would be more concerned about chapter house bills, more critical? Yeah, Jeff, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things based on what the research is saying is they're going to want to know more about where their money is going. I think we see that in a couple of different ways, whether it's how the chapter budgets are structured, Where is money going in terms of to IHQ, to loss prevention insurance, to the actual house and facility, to programming. They're going to want to know about that more than our previous group probably did. And part of that is likely due to many more of them having to finance and pay for their fraternity experience in a way that the millennials might not have. So I think as much information that can be shared through those financial pieces, the better it's going to be. And I think the more that's shared, the more buy-in that will be generated when they can understand and justify those expenses and see how they're coming back to not just benefit them, but benefit the entire fraternity and, you know, maybe the entire campus. Again, that idea of like the greater good being really important to them. All right, I think those are all the questions we had. Great questions, everyone. Thanks so much for sharing those. Thanks so much for participating in today's webinar. Like I said, this is being recorded, so we'll get this posted on the website in the next day or two. Highly recommend that book. Again, Generation Z Goes to College by Corey C. Miller and Megan Grace. Super easy, quick read. Again, I promise I'm not being paid to promote their book in any way. It was just a really great, easy resource. And Megan, I believe, actually works for or has worked for a fraternity headquarters in the past. And so that was cool to know as well that one of the authors had that fraternity background. So lots of information out there. More and more is going to continue to come out as we learn more about Generation Z and the way they're impacting the work that we do. Also want to put a quick plug in to everyone about the upcoming Advisors Academy taking place this February in conjunction with each of the 5 regional leadership academies. We will be having a one-day Advisor Academy program on the Saturday of each of those RLAs in February. It'll be a Saturday program, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. opportunity for advisors to do some in-person learning together, do some networking, have some good roundtable conversations. Registration will be available and open starting this week. More information will be out shortly regarding the schedule for all of those, but did want to put that quick plug in for all of you who are here right now and will listen to this on the recording. Really great opportunity to participate in some in-person DU advisor training coming up this February. Thanks again, everyone. If you ever have any recommendations for future advisor webinars, please don't hesitate to email me, marchand@deltau.org. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye.